group. It's certainly my pleasure to participate in this series. I think it's a really great idea, and I love the setting, so happy to be here. So this evening I'd like to again talk about this issue of air pollution and how it's now turned into a global phenomenon, and it has important implications for both how we manage air quality, but also its link to climate. And so tonight I'm going to talk about, I'll give you some examples of the growing reach of air pollution. I'm going to talk about the links between air pollution and climate change, because I think that's really important, and there's an opportunity now to make pretty significant advances on the climate side by dealing with air pollution. There's, I think, a window of opportunity there that we're working to try to realize. I'll talk just a little bit about the regional implications and impacts for this air pollution issue. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about, again, the policy implications in attempts to quantify the opportunities and then try to demonstrate the opportunities. So when we think of air pollution, I think most of us think of the urban environments as the really critical environments in the large cities of the world. And for the first time ever, we now have more people living worldwide in cities than we do in rural areas. So that's been a transformation, and especially the large cities. The reason people go to the cities is largely for increased opportunities, intense activities. The mega cities of the world are large generators of the regional GDP. But because of that intensity, they also tend to see the pollution problems first. But also, the megacities typically are also where the pollution actions, the policies are played out first. Take cities of the world, Beijing, Delhi. When they get around to doing it in that country, those regions occur first because they have the intellectual capacity, they have the money, and they have the political capacity to move things forward as people are living there and highly motivated. But we certainly are learning, and we certainly learned in the 70s and 80s that there could be a regional component to air pollution. And now we're learning, and acid rain was a great example. In the 70s, we saw the impact of, first to the loss of fish in the beautiful lakes of Sweden, far away from any local sources. And then we began to realize the range of air pollution. And we're now beginning to realize that that range of air pollution is beyond the regional scale. So we started with the urban environment. We've developed methods to try to deal with urban pollution. We realized there's a regional component. We're beginning to think about regional aspects of control, although those are not so easy. But now we're even faced with the growing understanding that perhaps even to manage the air quality of California, we're going to have to give much more thought to what's happening in Europe and Asia, for the rest of the northern hemisphere, if we're going to reach our air quality targets. So there's many ways that we know about this growing reach of air pollution, but especially on globalization. But really, it's come with our abilities of satellite capabilities. If we can see pollution at a global scale, have the capacity to detect pollution at a global scale, we can begin then to make the connection that pollutants can transport long distances. Our first example of that is in wind-blown dust. The early satellites were able to see, detect dust plumes being transported, at least attenuation by dust, and we could then begin to see the globalization. Now we have the capacity to see other trace species. So one that we can see from space is we're showing here CO. Actually, no, I'm sorry. The slide itself is NO2. And so we have polar orbiting satellites that are looking, following the sun and looking at the absorption of the NO2 molecule. And you can see now mapping out these large concentrations. So the darker, the redder the color, the higher the concentrations. And then you begin to see in the northern hemisphere, you pick out, the hot spots of Asia, Europe, North America. Then you see the southern hemisphere has a much different picture. It's not so associated with the large populated areas, but instead are more associated with the biomass burning signals. So NO2 arises from combustion, and so we see that in the southern hemisphere. We can also begin to look for the signal of the globalization of air pollution by looking at historic measurements of ozone. So ozone is a really important molecule. Ozone is something that we're very good at making. It's a major element of photochemical smog. So at the Earth's surface where we live as a product of our anthropogenic emissions, along with some natural emissions, we make ozone. So ozone near the surface is bad, but ozone in the stratosphere is good because it filters UV radiation. It plays a big role in allowing life to exist as we know it on this planet. But in terms of the bad ozone, the photochemical smog component, we have historical measurements going back into the late 1800s. And those were done, monks were doing it in well-documented techniques and wet chemical techniques that were able to reproduce and to validate that they have value. And so we put those together with the more modern record, and we can see that, and these are at isolated areas, mountain sites in remote or at least very rural areas of the globe, and you can see that the level of ozone in the global levels of ozone have increased significantly from about 10 to 15 parts per billion going back to the late 1800s to now we're at levels that concentrations are approaching above 40 to 50. So we've seen a triple of the global background of ozone. And I'm going to come back to this because our understanding of this is still not, we can't reproduce this in models. We can get present day levels pretty good, but we can't get the background levels, these long ago levels very well calculated. But this is going to have implication as I talk forward, because even these levels of 45, 50 parts per billion we're learning have impacts to plants. And so we have to be concerned with this growing background. So there's this rising background, but there's also this, again, as our population increases, we have growing numbers of pollutant levels around the world. And there's a recent study that was done called the Global Burden of Disease. And this is now being updated. I think it's under review right now. But they looked at all the different causes of disease from a health perspective and smoking, AIDS, other related activities, and looked at air pollution. And if you look at the air pollution contribution, these are the number of people at risk for high cardiovascular problems, either mortality or morbidity globally in the year 2000. And by this estimate, under current levels of pollution, you're seeing large numbers, and this is believed to be a conservative estimate of perhaps 1 million excess deaths per year, and in the U.S., avoidable deaths, if you will, due to elevated level of air pollution are under 50,000. And so the air pollution exposure and its impact to the global public health is very significant. And this slide just indicates the number of diseases already that have a strong quantitative link to a negative health outcome to exposure to air pollution, be it either things like ozone, primary pollutants, ozone or sulfur dioxide, but also particles are a big, in many regions of the world, the health implications of the fine particles is the major health indication. Not everywhere, but growing regions. So I mentioned this very briefly, that our understanding that the global environment, or certainly the hemispheric background levels of pollutions are increasing, and that's really very important. And let me just start, if we think of it from an air quality management perspective. So if I have an ozone concentration in Iowa, and we don't think of Iowa as having a large ozone problem, but the western part of the state is now getting really close to being in violation from the new ozone standard. And so the entire western U.S., including the mountainous region, are experiencing rising levels of ozone. But anywhere where we have the ozone or any pollutant level, we can think about that from an air quality management perspective. There's going to be a component of that air pollution that's due to local activities. Then there's going to be another component that's contributing that's coming from outside my local environment, but still from the national level. So think of the U.S. So we can think of, so Iowa has a local contribution, then we have a large regional contribution. So this is really what a nation has under its control, this portion. Then we have another component that's coming from outside our political borders, so that's the international component. And then we have another component that's natural, and from a pollution perspective, the definition of natural is not really solid. So natural could be wildfires coming from lightning. Okay. We think of natural as being also other forest fires, but of course we know that those other forest fires in general, be they by lightning or by accidental fires, also are related to human management of that resource. So it's not necessarily an absolutely natural component. We also think of natural as biogenic emissions, say hydrocarbons being emitted naturally by plants. So certain type of plants are heavy emitters of natural hydrocarbons. So those would be then contributing to pollution levels. So those are the components that we have. We don't have much control over the natural, but there is anthropogenic emissions that can be controlled in these, but obviously from a local perspective, our ability to influence those decisions are difficult.